Most engineers use OpenTelemetry every day without even knowing it. If you ever deployed the service with auto-instrumentation enabled or shipped to a collector sidecar, you were inside of the hotel pipeline. You just weren't tested on how it works. That's what OTCA exam does. It tests the inside of a pipeline. I'll tell you exactly what the exam covers, where the points are, and what I would study differently if I were starting over. And yes, I'll tell you my score, but you'll wait to the end of this video for that. The collector is where people underestimate this exam, because it's 26% of all the questions. Most engineers treat it like a sidecar, something you drop in, forget about that, and it just forwards. But the exam treats it as a pipeline. There are receivers, processors, and exporters wired as a named pipeline. The order of the processor is not arbitrary. Memory limiter goes first and the batch goes last before the export. There are questions specifically about this. The mistake most people make is studying observability backends. They study Prometheus, Grafana, Jagger, but that is not what the exam is about. OTCA is about the layer that sits in front of all of those. The instrumentation, the data pipeline, and how your code generates a span, where that span goes inside of the SDK, how the collector receives it, transforms it, and ships it out. You can have Prometheus running perfectly in production and still fail this exam, because the OTCA tests the SDK internals, providers, processors, exporters, propagators, not what's on the other side. The exam is 60 multiple choice questions, 90 minutes, and the passing score is 75%. There are 4 domains, API and SDK, which are 46% of the exam, and nearly half of the questions are about the SDK pipeline internals that most people never used. Collector is 26%. There are pipeline config questions, deployment modes, and scaling behavior. Fundamentals of observability is another 18%, mostly conceptual. They ask you about the traces, metrics, logs, and semantic conventions. Those questions are mostly 3 points. Maintaining and debugging are the last 10%. That's the smallest domain, and you just need to know the debugging patterns. The 18% of the fundamentals is a low effort and high return. If you understand what trace is, what the metric data points look like, and why semantic conventions exist, you are getting most of it. The SDK domain is the opposite. Prior hotel experience helps, but I added this library to my service saying it's not enough. The exam asks which layer owns a specific behavior, and the wrong answers are always plausible hotel concepts that are placed in the wrong scope. Domain 1 is the API and SDK, and that's the place where the exam is won. Start with the provider model, the tracer provider, method provider, and the logger provider. Each one is the entry point for its signal type. From there, trace the data path. Providers create instrumentations or spans, processors transform or batch them, and exporters send them out. That's the pipeline. Every what happens when question is asking about one of those 3 layers. The critical distinction is API versus the SDK. The API defines the interfaces and the SDK implements them. Questions will ask which layer owns a specific behavior. If you have been reading them as the same thing, you'll miss those questions. To be honest, context propagation punches above its weights on the exam. No in-process propagation, baggage and span context flowing through the function calls via the language context API. No cross-process propagation, the W3C trace context format, the trace parent header, and what each field contains. B3 is an older format, but it still shows up on an exam. File-based SDK is on the exam. The structure is provider contains processor, contains exporter. Once you see that hierarchy in the YAML, the config questions become straightforward for you. Domain 2 is the collector, not just a sidecar. The collector is a pipeline. Receivers accept the data, processors transform it, and exporters send it. These are wired together in named pipelines under the service.pipelines. One collector config can have the separate pipelines for the traces, metrics, and logs, each with its own set of components. Processor order is a real exam topic. Memory limiter must come first because it protects the collector process from getting ORM killed before it can shed the load. But should be last before the export because it reduces the number of the outbound requests. Flip those two and you can build the config that will fail under the load. There are two deployment modes. First one is the agent mode, which is a collector per node running as a daemon set or a sidecar, receiving from local services and scaling with your nodes. Gateway mode is a central collector cluster that aggregates from agents or directly from the SDK. Stateful processors like tail sampling need careful routing in gateway mode, because related spans have to land on the same instance. I started with LFCS 148, that's the Linux Foundation free course, which is an intro to the OpenTelemetry. That's where the API versus the SDK distinction finally clicked for me. And after that I was doing the official docs with a notepad, not skimming, actually writing down what each component owns and which lifestyle phase it belongs to. 6 hours across 3 sessions. Actually I would say that OTCA is underrated as a study tool. It's a full microservices app that is instrumented across the multiple languages. And running it locally and reading the SDK configuration files gave me the more practical intuition for the collector that any tutorial could. What didn't help? I spent too much time on the language-specific SDK examples, but the exam is language agnostic. As a result, 2 hours I couldn't get back. And I'm not sure third-party collector scaling content I read was current. Some of it referenced the patterns that changed between the versions. For that topic specifically, stick to the official collector docs. Everything I leaned on is on this slide. If you only do 2 things, then take the LFS 148, the Free Linux Foundation course, for the concepts, and run the hotel demo up to see a real multi-language pipeline end-to-end. The books and official docs are on the right, are there when you want the detail behind a specific component. Let's speak about the results. My final score is 83 and it was the first attempt, passing score is 75. The SDK pipeline questions were where the points came from. The collector processor ordering questions I got right specifically because I have read the official config docs. The practice test that I built from my prep scenarios is on the YetMike website. I used it to find the gaps in my API versus the SDK understanding before the exam day. Do the same and find your gaps there instead of on the exam. OpenTelemetry is the translation layer between your code and your observability backends. The exam tests the inside of that translation layer. Stop thinking about Grafana, start thinking about what happens between the span creation and wire export. Links are in the comments, see you in the next one.